Hello and welcome to the Forcetronics blog and YouTube channel. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about using interrupts with the Arduino Uno or the Arduino Pro Mini. Okay, and I know this page is a little text heavy, but I just want to kind of lay out what the interrupt is and how it's used. So what is an interrupt? An interrupt is a way to react to some asynchronous external event immediately. So for instance, if we're monitoring a pin, we can do it in the main loop of the Arduino, but we're polling, we're checking it every once in a while, and there's going to be times when it could happen and we can't react right away. So let's say you're using something like a rotary knob, or you want to react right away to some type of button push from a user. That's the way to go, is interrupts, because an interrupt, the Arduino will stop executing the code where it's at and will immediately jump to the interrupt code. So for the Arduino Uno or equivalent, the interrupt pins there's two interrupt pins, pin 2 and pin 3. So digital pin 2, digital pin 3. And if you look in the documentation, it refers it to interrupt 0 pin and interrupt 1 pin. So an interrupt can be triggered by any type of change of voltage level on that pin. And you can set it to react to a level high, a level low. You can set it to react to a change. If the voltage level changes, whether it's high or low, it'll trigger an interrupt. Or you can do a falling or rising edge. So what happens when an interrupt occurs? Well, when an interrupt occurs, the chip will jump to the interrupt service routine. And all this is a function. So you basically have a function that you build that when the interrupt occurs, the code in that function is executed. Now there is some limitations on that function. So you can't take in any arguments, any input arguments, or you cannot return anything with that function. And to be honest, you don't want to do too much in that function. It specifies to make the code short. You can use global variables in the function, and I'll show you how to do that in an example. For the example I'm going to show for the interrupt, here's my example setup. So you could have an Arduino Uno or an Arduino Pro Mini, and all I'm going to do is use a button. You could also use a switch for this example, and basically I'm going to close it to send a level high to digital pin 2 to trigger the interrupt. And when that happens, it's going to cause the LED to start blinking. And I'm just using the built-in LED on the board for this example. Notice that I do have a 10 kilo ohm resistor connected to ground. This may be optional. I just put this there so that the pin doesn't float, so it doesn't have some kind of floating voltage level. So I did tie it to ground through a high resistance. Okay, let's look at the Arduino code before we check out the example. Okay, here is the Arduino code for our example, and basically what we're going to do in our example is when the interrupt occurs, we're going to trigger an interrupt, and then it's going to cause pin 13 to blink. So here's my variable for pin 13. Here is my variable for the interrupt. So I call it BLED for blink LED, and I'm creating a global variable and I'm initializing it to 0. But notice this tag, volatile. This is telling the compiler that this is a special variable and it's going to be used in an interrupt. So we want to have that tag on any global variables we'll be using in the interrupt service routine. In my setup code, this is where I enable or create the interrupt with this function attach interrupt. The 0 means pin 2, so I'm using the interrupt 0 pin, which is digital pin 2. If I were to set it to 1, it would be pin 3. This word right here, interrupt function, is the interrupt service routine, or the ISR. So that's down here, which I'll talk about in a second, but I'm basically telling the Arduino which function to call when an interrupt is triggered. Then high means what triggers the interrupt. So when a high level is detected at that pin, that is the interrupt occurring. It could be a low here, or I could have change for any change of level. For pin mode, I'm just creating the output pin for pin 13, the LED pin. Then if we go to the main loop, we see that if blink LED is 0, then do nothing. So basically this will not occur, the LED will not be blinked unless that variable goes to something other than 0. Well, how will that occur? There's nothing in the loop to make that happen. Well, that's where the interrupt comes in. So if we go down here to the interrupt function, which is the interrupt service routine, this is the function that's called when the interrupt occurs. All I do in the function is I set BLED to 1. So we're just going to go through this loop, and then once the interrupt occurs, wherever the Arduino is in this code, it will stop, then set this variable to 1, and then return to this code. So when the interrupt occurs, we'll set it to 1, and we should see the LED start to blink. Now before we go to the example, I want to explain some of the commented out code in here. So if we start here, I commented this out just so you have it for example purposes. You can always turn the interrupt capability off. So we set up our interrupt up here, but let's say there's some type of code we don't want the interrupt to occur during because it's important code that can't be interrupted. So we can disable the interrupt using this function, no interrupts. We can then execute our time-sensitive code, and then we can turn the interrupts back on. So there's a way to turn off the interrupts if you're in some type of code that you don't want to be interrupted. And then lastly, you see detach interrupt here. So let's say you just want the interrupt to occur once or a couple of times, and then you eventually want to shut it off. Because once we set it up, once the interrupt happens, it can happen again and again and again. Detach interrupt down here will actually shut the interrupt off, and I'm telling it to shut 0 off, because that's the one we have, pin 2. Okay, let's look at the example, and by the way, this code will be posted on my blog if you want to copy it. Okay, here we are at the video, and I'm going to blow your mind by showing you a video inside of a video. But here you can see my setup. I just have a simple push button. I'm using the Arduino Mini, but this will work just the same on the Uno. I even tried it to make sure. So I have my Arduino Pro Mini. I have my programming port. You can see the 10 kilo ohm resistor, and then I have my wiring hooking up to my switch. So I'm just going to press the switch momentarily, and we should see the LED pin 13 start to blink. So you can see me, I'm about to push the button. Here I go. I press the button, and you can see the LED blinking. So simple example, but shows the power of interrupts. So there you have it, how to interrupt your Arduino. So we looked at how to use the interrupts capability for the Arduino Uno as well as equivalent Arduinos. Pretty easy. Interrupts are for if you want to react to some external asynchronous event right away. If you want to grab the Arduino code that you saw in this example, go to my blog. Also, if you want to do a deep dive into interrupts, there's a great web page out there, and you can see the link here. Please, if you enjoyed this video and you're on my blog or YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe to my Forcetronics YouTube channel. And if you have any questions, you can email me. Thank you for watching.